Today is actually the anniversary of Thomas Merton's death. This is one of my favorite pictures of Merton. He's full of mirth. He almost looks impish. His eyes almost always look serious, but here he's, squinting. And by the way, he died at the age of 53. 53. He was a month away, about a month and a half away from his 54th birthday. But he did not live a long, long life. But his influence is huge, as you will see, I hope. So next slide. Let's do a little bit of review of his journey on Earth. He's born in Prades, France, the son of Owen and Ruth. His mother was a Quaker artist, and he's baptized in the Anglican Church there in France. He moves to a little section of Queens. Douglastown, New York is in the eastern edge of the Queens borough in that August. His mother dies from stomach cancer, and he is 6 years old when that happens. He moves a mere 4 years later to France. This is important because he will learn to speak fluent French. He will also master a number of other languages. His father then moves him to England, enrolls him in a prep school. He's diagnosed with a brain tumor. And then when Thomas Merton is 15, his father dies from that brain tumor. And Tom Bennett, who was a friend of Owen Merton's in New Zealand, becomes his guardian. He gets a scholarship to Clare College in Cambridge. He has a kind of mystical experience at the age of 18 while he's in Rome, and he's transfixed by this mosaic of Christ there at Palatine Hill. He leaves Cambridge, England, and returns to the United States in 14. He's 19. He enrolls at Columbia University and will graduate 4 years later with a BA in English. He has a mystical experience that year. He graduated in May or June. Just a few months later, he senses that he has maybe a call to the priesthood. He has that in a parallel experience as he's reading about Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a great poet. You can look up a poem called God's Grandeur. He's a great poet in the history of poetry written in English. That inspires him. He will write or think about writing a PhD on Gerard Manley Hopkins. He never does, but he thinks about it. He's received into the Catholic Church in 1938, later on that fall, November 16th, at a church that you can go to today, and finishes a master's thesis. But the more important thing is he's rejected in his attempt to become a Franciscan monk, become part of the Franciscan community after St. Francis. They're the ones, just to be real simplistic about it, with the brown robes. Some of them have black robes. They also, like Jesuits, and like the order that Merton will join, which is part of the Benedictine order, and they take a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we'll see what those mean a little bit later in real life for Merton. He goes on a retreat to Kentucky, and why he goes there is not exactly clear to me, except that he was invited, meet somebody. They say, why don't you come to Our Lady of Gethsemane in Kentucky? This is near Bardstown, Kentucky. Bardstown probably is more known for making bourbon, distilling bourbon, than for anything else. But very near there is this Gethsemane Abbey. And he goes there in April of 40, during Holy Week, by the way. And a year and a half later, he enters into that abbey, wanting to pursue a life as a monastic. He goes through the paces of becoming a novice monk, and then he will also become ordained. And that takes, though, 7.5 years. And in the process, he writes his very first book of poems, very first book, which is a book of poems called 30 Poems. He had met Robert Giroux while he was at Columbia. And Robert Giroux is Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, great publishing company. He had met him there, and they will take a very big interest in him, and especially his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain. This is hard for me to really capture for you because we don't have a parallel in contemporary times. When this hits, they did not think it would sell, but within probably 6 months, it had sold 700,000 copies. Bishop Sheen, does anybody know who that is? He was a famous bishop. He had a television program way back in the 50s, but he writes a blurb for it. Graham Greene likes it. Evelyn Waugh likes this book, and they write glowingly about how important this is, and this becomes a phenomenon. Now, how does a monk who's supposed to be separated away from the world get into being a writer? Well, his abbot at the abbey recognized his talent for writing. His name was Frederick Dunn, and he was the abbot there from the time that Merton entered until 1948. And so up to the publishing of this book, this abbot told him, would you please write your autobiography? You've got a story to tell. Later, the following abbot, James Foss, will continue to tell him to write, and Merton writes and writes and writes and writes, and what he's writing is almost always things for the monks or for Catholicism as a whole to appreciate. Where did the Desert Fathers come from? What were they like? What's the early churches like? What's prayer about? How do monastics live? Explain this to an interesting and interested and ever more interested world. So he's being encouraged to write. He writes about everything, monastic and contemplative matters, about social issues eventually into the 60s, race relations, war and peace and poverty. And he begins to attain in the early 60s an international reputation. And he maintains a voluminous correspondence. It is said that he wrote 15,000 letters from the time that he entered Gethsemane in 1941 until his death 27 years later. That's a lot of letters. In 65, he beseeches Abbot Fox to allow him to live as a hermit. Now, this may not be a cup of tea of any of us, okay? To live as a hermit, meaning away from even the community. It's a very strange thing to live in a monastic community. You're given to normally silence and praying and working in a rhythmic kind of routine to your day and to your life. But then you can even seek further depths into solitude. And that's when you want to live as a hermit. And he seeks that, and he's granted that privilege. We'll see a picture of his little cabin. In 68, on September the 11th, coincidentally, he's gotten permission from the abbot to do this, and he goes on an Asian journey to meet people in the East and talk about monastic traditions and contemplative prayer. And so he will eventually meet the Dalai Lama in India for the very first time on November the 4th. He will meet another guy named Chatrel Rinpoche, who is another guru from the Himalayan kind of Buddhist that are populated in Bhutan as well as in India. They were kicked out of Tibet, so they can't be there. And he will have these great, great encounters. That's on the way to Bangkok. And in Bangkok, there's a very big gathering of Asian Benedictines and Cistercians. I'll tell you what Cistercians are like a little bit later. It's a little bit complicated, but you'll get it. But there's an ecumenical conference in Thailand, and he's giving lectures there. He finishes up and he says, well, I will now disappear. No, we'll now take some time to have a Coke, he says. He's a regular person. We'll all have a Coke and I shall disappear. And he's being jocular, right? He's being kind of joking. And he goes and takes a shower. And when he comes out of the shower, he accidentally is electrocuted on an open hot wire that's connected to a fan in his room. And coincidentally, he dies on the 27th anniversary of his arrival at Gethsemane. By the way, he's flown back in a plane. Remember, this is 1968. This was the year of the Tet Offensive, I believe, and the height of the Vietnam War, when there was nightly, sadly, body counts broadcast on television in the evening news, and he will fly back in a plane of Americans who had been killed in the Vietnam War. Very poignantly and poetically appropriate, since he had protested that war so strongly. His funeral is held back in Kentucky on December 17th. In '69, the Thomas Merton Center is established at Bellarmine University. It is the official and the largest collection of Merton materials. Then 17 years later, I don't know why it took him so long, but the International Thomas Merton Society is formed there also in connection with the Thomas Merton Center. Significantly, in 2015, when Pope Francis came to America and addressed Congress, I hope you remember some of that, or some of you will remember when that took place. Pope Francis uplifts 4 Americans as exemplary persons to be inspired by and to follow after their lives' example. One was Abraham Lincoln, another is Martin Luther King, another is Dorothy Day, and then the 4th one was Thomas Merton. It says the many stories. The guy in the film clip calls it the many lives, the many lives. Well, story is more important because it echoes his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain. Well, where does that come from? It comes from Dante's Purgatorio and Divine Comedy, where purgatory is viewed as a kind of 7-storied experience. And so Merton used that imagery, and that's really the final title for the this film done in 2015. The Many Stories, Not Many Lives, and Last Days of Thomas Merton. One other thing I need to say before we move forward. In the late or mid-60s, Merton was hospitalized with some back issues and had some surgery. And he fell in love with a young nurse, Margie Smith. She was known in his journal just as M. And they had, according to various interpretations, either a chaste, meaning non-physical affair, and then other commentators, interpreters view that it was a physically embodied affair eventually. So he broke his vow, whether he did it physically or emotionally or spiritually, emotionally. He broke his vow of chastity, which is very important to anybody entering into the priesthood in general. That's a general commitment and vow that is taken. Not all priests take vows of poverty. They take vows of chastity as well as obedience to the structure of the Catholic Church. It might be a bishop, it might be an abbot if you're in a monastic community. But there's this third one of obedience, chastity, and poverty. The third one being poverty for all monastics. They all take a vow of poverty. But he broke the vow of chastity. And he was eventually forgiven that by his abbot and his order. Not that the order probably knew about it during his lifetime, but the abbot surely did. And his confessor, Thomas Keating, also knew about it. And he cut it off, no more. They did not ever meet again. And he went back to the vows that he had pledged himself to when he entered Gethsemane. One of the things to think about is you're looking at that picture of a man, and this is on the way or near his hermitage. He wrote so much in merely 20 years of living as a monk. He wrote 36 books. Well, he wrote more than that, but he published 36 books in 20 years. He enters in, and it is, or 33, and then he is, from the day of his ordination, he's 33, and then he dies 20 years later. It's amazing, amazing trajectory. So I just wanted you to have that because this is going to come up in some commentary in the Q&A, I think, later. Okay, next slide. Well, I think that it's easy to see that he's an enrapturing study of contrast. He loves solitude, but he's famously connected, isn't he, with a lot of people. He wrote compelling books about prayer and also social justice issues and concerns. He's devoted to God, but he also loves the good gifts of God's world. We're going to see that in a prayer in just a moment that he prays, or not in the Revelation. You won't believe his extraordinary affirmation of the world. He's a Catholic monk, but he's also little c Catholic, meaning he's universal or global in his yearnings to learn about prayer from any religious tradition he can. He's singular in his genius, solitary in his devotional practice, but he's also part of a community. He is a Trappist. Now, who are the Trappists? They are the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, the OCSO. And these are people who take silence and listening for God very, very seriously. That's the Trappists. Now, that's an offshoot of the Cistercians, and they are an offshoot of the Benedictines. So it goes back quite a way. The Benedictines were started in 594. Then the Cistercians are founded in 1098. Takes the Catholics a long time to evolve, huh? And then in 1664, and it takes them 230 years before they're official. The Trappists come into existence finally by 1892. All right. So that's Benedictines, then Cistercians, then Trappists. And they're all in the Benedictine lineage. But that is Merton's kind of monkish provenance. He has an epiphany in the middle of Louisville, and this is in 1958. And I want to read this. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being man, or we would say human, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. So Louisville is proud to have this street named after him, the Thomas Merton Square, but also the this revelation that is listed and posted there at near 4th and Walnut. Next slide. So what Merton showed us is that faith is a common way of life. And by the way, that'd be implied for all religious traditions. He says, this is not a hermitage where he lived. It is a house. What I wear is pants. What I do is live. How I pray is breathe. I love that directness and bluntness. And it is common. Next slide. Prayer is experientially connecting with God, not being fancy pants, about words that you say, but spending time alone with God. And he viewed it as necessary for human fulfillment. His approach was straightforward, simple, paying attention to God's presence and God's will and love. And by the way, let me just use a person that we've used before. We've done Mary Oliver. I believe we have. Yeah, we've done Mary Oliver. And she said this about prayer. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention. Then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice can speak. That's very much Thomas Merton. I don't know if she got it from him. I don't think so. But it's very, very much in the spirit of Thomas Merton. He also showed us about contemplative prayer and that it was a premier way of writing at unity between ourselves and God, unity in the human community. And that contemplative prayer really moves you to experiential contact with God. Next slide. And then this is one of Merton's most memorable prayers. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so, but I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. This he writes a mere 10 years after he's ordained, a mere 17 years after he enters the monastery. And I think it's a prayer that could be repeated by any one of us many times a day. What makes Merton a great soul? Well, he has extraordinary knowledge about and authentic approach to prayer. I believe that's one of his highlights. He has lasting popularity and prominence as a writer. He made contemplative practices more understandable and accessible. He had an exemplary conjoining of both social justice and spiritual concerns. He did both all the time. He had an increased interest and involvement. He increased an interest and involvement in the Christian faith. It was said that there was lots of conversions after his book was so popular. People flooded monastic abbeys and monasteries, and a lot of people came to faith that wouldn't have otherwise. Next slide. He had, as I just said, increased access to monastic vocations for Catholics, but also previously non-religious people like himself. Sixthly, he showed a way, he showed a way for enhanced ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. Interfaith and ecumenical dialogue had never enjoyed as much prominence and engagement as after Thomas Merton came on the scene. He just wrenched it up. He ratcheted it up quite a bit. And also he incensed conservative Catholics. You saw that in the film clip, right? Some people said, oh, good, now he won't do so much harm. I'm glad he's dead. And literally, there were people who said this, and they took great umbrage at how he was challenging the status quo with regard to race relations, saying that the problem of the Negro, that was his language, is the problem of our time in American history. He inspired, however, progressive reformers and activists within the Catholic Church to have fared thee well in ways that nobody else had. He is probably the most powerful influence on Catholicism in the 20th century, more so than Dorothy Day, more so than almost any bishop. He just impacted it powerfully and lastingly. And the continuing popularity of his books, his teachings about contemplative prayer and all the rest are evidence of that. Well, this was a long presentation and I apologize. I hope it was engaging for you.